talk about the emotional core. I'm excited to learn what that is. And Banana's going to join in a couple of minutes too. So it might look like it's just me one person, but we have under promise and over deliver here. So you're going to get two people with this. So let's welcome Fertessa.
Hello, my name is Fertessa Scott, and I'm a game designer from Atlanta, Georgia. So I've been designing games for 3 years, and I have my first game signed called Bookability with Gold Seal Games, and that should come out in 2021. And my second game was recently signed, Wicked and Wise, and that is with Weird Draft Games, and that will also be coming out in 2021. So today I wanted to talk about finding the emotional core of your game. Before I started, I wanted to see if we were starting out with the same definition of emotional core. Does anyone have an idea of what an emotional core is? Okay, so my definition of an emotional core is going to be something that's intangible. You can't edit it, you can't change it about your game. It's something that you can build your game around. For me, it's going to be the moment you become addicted or hooked to your game, when it goes from just an idea that can become a game to a game that you specifically have to make. So, for example, whenever I was making Bookability, my hook was whenever I thought back to, playing with my friends, playing Yu-Gi-Oh with my friends, and, really getting into it and going back and forth, just trash talking each other and making it really dramatic. I wanted that for my game, and I wanted that atmosphere, and that became the core that I was chasing when I was creating Bookability. Now, I said that I created Bookability, and I've been designing for 3 years. I'd always been playing games all my life, but I didn't get into the hobby until around 3 years ago, right when I started designing my game. I only knew about Monopoly, Risk, Spades, just kind of the casual games that you would find at Target or, just even non-gamers would play. And so whenever I started designing my game, I started researching, delving into Board Game Geek and, going into conventions, and I was suddenly exposed to so many things. On the one hand, that meant that I had all these different influences to pick from and all these different sources of information to help me flesh out my game. But on the other hand, that meant that I had a huge amount of information coming at me at once, and it was overwhelming. And that's why the emotional core is so important, because even for someone who has no knowledge of game mechanics or techniques or, just knowledge of any of the many thousands of games that are out there, you can still chase after and develop your game with an emotional core. Because that is something that you specifically know, and only you can know what feels right for your game. Whenever you are going after the emotional core, you want it to be something that can act kind of like a guiding light. So whenever you are, let's say, getting really excited about your game and you're building a mechanic, you don't want to attach yourself to the mechanics of the game. You don't want to attach yourself to the physical components. You want to instead attach to the idea of what your game is going to become. Whenever I was doing writing, I was told that before you write anything, you need to think about who your audience is and what you want them to feel. And I think that that can transfer to game design. You need to think about who your audience is and how you want them to react and interact with your game. So just like I drew from that memory of playing with my friends who were casual players to non-gamers, and I had that memory of them getting really dramatic and into this game, that it didn't even really matter what was going on in the game. They were bringing a story to the game. It was a game that allowed them to bring a story into the game and bring their personal life into it, and that was the type of game that I was chasing. So it doesn't have to be something super specific. It just has to be kind of a memory, a feeling that addicts you to your own game. So, I want to talk about Bookability. Bookability was my very first game, and I worked on it for 2 years. I'm still working on it, but it was 2 years before it was published. And like I mentioned, when I started, I had very little knowledge. I didn't know what game mechanics were. I didn't know the terms. So I started with what I knew. On this board over here, I showed some of the iterations that I went through on my game. That's all the same game, and it changed its form so much. And I would like to say that that's because I had the emotional core, so it gave me the courage to discard entire parts of my game and start over, because it didn't really feel like starting over since I had that core, no matter which one it went to. Originally, it kind of had a look of Monopoly about it, because that's what I had to draw from. And I didn't know how to move people or pieces.
I'm working everything.
This is Banana Chan.
Hi.
I'm explaining my Bookability's different changes. Those are like 9 of the maybe 20 different versions I made of it. But I was trying to figure out how to move the pieces, so different versions were just me figuring out how to put people on the board, how to get cards in their hand. It went from squares to circles to eventually tiles. And that's how I figured out, this fits for my game. This gets that emotion and that environment going that I want to invoke in my players. But it took 2 years to get there, and it took a lot of failures, frustrations, creative blocks. And the thing that got me going after like 2 months of a break and just trying to dive into all these podcasts and playing other people's board games, the thing that always focused me back was going back to that original thought of, are the players reacting to my game in the way that I originally wanted them to? And that helped me so much.
So how did you,
Yeah.
how did you figure out like what you wanted to do with this game? Like, did you think you were going to self-publish? Did you think you were going to like pitch it to a publisher, or what were you thinking?
Originally, I felt really, really selfish about things that I created, and I was really possessive that I didn't want anything to be changed. So I was like, I think I have to self-publish, because if you give it to a publisher, you have to be in a place where you're willing to accept changes for the better of your game to make it more marketable. But over the course of 2 years, I realized that the things I was placing importance on in my game weren't actually important, and that I had managed to build a game that even if I handed it to a publisher, its center, the core, would stay the same. So at some point, I became really okay with handing it off to another person, and I decided to start pitching maybe a year and a half into developing the game. And I pitched it, and I was able to get it signed.
And so when you're doing playtesting or like development in general, how do you sort of maneuver around feedback? Like, how do you know what feedback you want to, listen to? How do you know there's like other stuff that maybe I'm not going to integrate this in my game?
Yeah. So feedback is one of my favorite things. With feedback, it's very hard for me to digest things in the moment. One, I don't handle multiple things at one time very well. And 2, I wouldn't be able to like fully digest what somebody is saying if I was at the same time kind of deciding this is what I want to keep, this is important, maybe I should listen to this part. So whenever I'm playtesting, I always have a notebook, so many notebooks, and I write down everything. I write down what the players are saying, I write down what the players are doing. Even if they don't directly comment on something, I think about, again, who I envision playing my game and how I expect them to react, and I write that down because later I can look back and say, okay, they weren't reacting in the way that I expected. Is this good? Is this bad? It gives me plenty of time to analyze it if I make all these neutral notes just depicting what's going on. And even if somebody says something like, for like a few years ago when I was testing bookability, people played it and they said, why did you choose this name? I explained, and then they were just like, what if you call it Book of Heroes or something? It was the complete opposite. And my gut reaction was, why would I do that? It's about villains. But I wrote it down. Later found out one of them was a police person. So of course they wouldn't want to play a game without big villains. But you can't let your gut reactions kind of guide you, because things that people say, it may not necessarily originally make sense to you in that moment, but there may be an underlying cause as to why they say it. And the reasoning is something that could be insightful to your game design later. So I always write down everything, and then later, at my own discretion, agree or disagree with it. Because I think it's more valuable just to write it down.
So you've gone through multiple iterations of the game, you've gotten like a lot of feedback. Like, what do you think was like the hardest challenge for you, or what was like the biggest hurdle for you?
For my first game, the biggest hurdle was figuring out how to mitigate luck and understanding luck. Because going into that, my favorite game was Monopoly. And a lot of people do not like Monopoly, don't like dice rolling, don't like luck. And I had to kind of come to terms with, one, dice weren't necessarily the end-all component, and two, was that something that gelled with my game? So when I thought about the core, I had to think, do I want people who are going to be super strategic about it and figure out, just what depth of strategy did I want in my game? And repeat that.
Oh, what was the biggest hurdle?
Yeah, thank you. And I don't know, dealing with that, figuring out, if a mechanic was right for my game versus if it was just something that me as a beginning designer was struggling to understand. That was my biggest hurdle. It was that experience gap. So that I think I came to time and time again whenever I felt very anxious about losing the identity of my game, because I couldn't necessarily decide if it was something that I felt was right or if it was something I was doing because other designers or other gamers were telling me it was the trendy thing to do. And it took probably a good year to really push past that phase, particularly with like online feedback. The difference between online feedback and in-person feedback is so very great, and you have to kind of really take it with a grain of salt, because they're not even necessarily touching your game and giving an opinion, and it can be very shocking if you don't know how to kind of mitigate that with what you've already been told in person.
So you obviously spent a lot of time on this, and this is sort of like your passion project. What do you think is like the most personal part of the game for you?
For bookability, I think the most personal thing would be everyone is a villain, but it's because for me the story there is I have kind of a resting mischief face. And so in any sort of game where you're deducting who's the evil person, I automatically get weeded out just because my face, it looks like I'm up to no good. So I was like, I want to create a game where everybody's the villain, But the humor of that, because in my game, in bookability, everybody's villains, but they're not very good at it. So they're writing a book about being a villain instead. And you're collecting pages of that book. So that humor, and that wackiness is really important to me in that game, and that's what I really try to keep as I iterate with it.
I think it's really cool telling the story from a different perspective. Like, you're not a hero, you're talking you know, as if you were a villain, which is like a great way to sort of, you know, tell a different perspective, tell a different story. Do you think you'll do more games that are like that, or what do you think is going to be in the future for you?
So I hope to. My next game, Wicked and Wise, is a trick-taking game, an entirely different mechanics going on, but I still wanted to keep that humor. That one is more of a partnering game, and I find that I'm always going back to games that were close to my heart, my childhood, and this one is based off of spades. So I wanted a game where you're partnered, but each partner has a specific role, and one is in charge of the trick taking, and one is playing action cards, which manipulate what kind of cards your partner can get. So like your partner is going to be trying to win tricks with low cards, and the other partner, the wicked one, is in charge of getting the high cards and feeding them to the partner. So I really like that kind of element of being able to pull off like this really clutch play with minimal cards that nobody expected it to, and your partner's like, yes. So I think right now I'm just kind of chasing after games that really give that feeling, that laughter and that drama that you can get with your friends.
I really like this sort of theme of duality in your games. Like it's definitely there, like, you know, with workability and like the trick-taking game. Do you have any like pieces of media, like maybe movies or TV shows that you draw like this inspiration from?
I'm a bit everywhere. I can't even say because just Korean dramas, anime. I'm really all over the place.
What kind of Korean dramas are you watching, or like animes that you're watching right now?
Oh my God. You know, there's Attack on Titan and Evangelion, Cowboy Bebop. There's so many, all the sports manga, all the shonen manga, any sort of underdog manga. I love underdogs, anything. Same with Korean dramas. It's underdog. The underdog story is what really gets me. So one exercise that I wanted to do is in the way that the game designer can create an emotional core when they're making their game, the same thing happens with the player. So whenever you think about a game that you want to bring out during game night, or if somebody says, hey, you want to play this, and you're immediately like, yes, this is my game, that moment is your emotional core as a player. And I want you to kind of think about one of your favorite games and why you pull that out to the table. For me, as I mentioned before, spades, which is a trick-taking game, my moment is whenever I can win a trick with a low card that should not have gone by. I'd be like, I win a card with a jack. That wasn't supposed to happen. But now I have bragging rights for the whole game. I'm like, that's a bad jack. You know? And that's my addicting moment to the game. So if you guys feel like sharing, does anybody have a favorite game and like a moment that addicts them to that game, that makes them bring it out to the table?
I have one. So I love playing Machi Koro because I love that feeling of I'm gonna put this down, oh, and then I can take this and I can take that and I collect all this money. Like that's that feeling that I really like.
Yeah.
I don't gamble. So this is like my version of gambling.
Yes. Yes.
Does anyone else have it?
Mission Red Planet is pretty cool in that when you can just have like a secret objective or just play your cards in just the right, order to really screw somebody else over and just give yourself a lot of points when it didn't look like you were going to get anything that night.
Yes.
That's very good.
That's an excellent game.
Battlestar Galactica, when you have the Cylon, you're sabotaging everything and no one gets to kill the Cylon. Those are my favorite.
Anybody else?
Natural 20s.
Yeah.
Red Dragon Inn. It's news that I don't like just attacking other people's game,
Yeah.
but it's just something about the whole fact that everyone is there just having a good time, and their characters are just drinking and just screwing around. You know, you're technically beating each other down. It's just like, I give you a drink, you bash, oh, thank you. It's like you bought me a drink.
Those moments are what you really need to think about whenever you are starting your own game design, because I think that if you manage to create your core and you have a player that lines up with it, that is a truly magical moment, a magical game, and I think that's what you really want to aspire to. And I will say that as much as finding the core helped me as a beginning designer, it also helps you when you're experienced, because say that you sign your game with a publisher, or you decide to co-design your game with somebody else. The danger there is that you are no longer the only source of thoughts for your game. And so it can be very easy to feel like you are losing the identity of your game because there is an influx of ideas coming from one side. Maybe that person, their timing is faster than you, so they can iterate more quickly than you. Or, you know, maybe you kind of want to take a step back because of life and you don't have time to play test and the other person does. And I feel like having that core is very helpful to just your mentality and your mental health and your happiness with the game, because no matter what changes come through the game, you can say, is it still chasing this center, this core? And if it is, okay, that's fine. So I think that it's very essential, no matter what stage of game design that you're in. And it's something that you don't need any tools or knowledge to do. You can change any part of your game, any physical part of it, but this part should never, it should always stay the same.
Do you ever get pushback from like publishers or anyone else? And if not, then that's awesome. Tell us who the publisher is. And if you do, then how do you deal with it?
So I do get pushback occasionally, and usually I kind of ask the reasoning, because I'm the type that if you can logically explain it, then I can accept it. So for elements of my game, or our game now, if if there was a mechanic that I wanted to test out and they said, I don't like it going in that direction, then I kind of think about it and I'm just like, we can approach it in a different way. For me, again, I just go back to that idea of what did I want my game to be, and if I can't approach it in the way that I originally want to, then I just have to change the route.
It's weird having to get rid of things, or like having to do things for like a client,
Yeah.
or like another publisher.
Yeah.
Is there like, do you have any tips or tricks on like how to manage that?
I would say, for me, you want to create your own boundaries, and that can be boundaries with communication, because there could be different points of frustration. It could be that they communicate more than you, or you communicate more than them. It could be that maybe you don't feel heard whenever you want your changes to go through. So you have to figure out what your boundaries are, and you have to kind of be very blunt about them with your publisher and say, hey, whenever we're talking about changes, can we have them in this sort of a spreadsheet? Or, hey, whenever we are doing changes, I'm going to respond to you, but I need maybe a couple of days or a week to kind of digest it before I give you my interpretation of what's going on. So really, I have to think about how I take in information and how I effectively work on projects, and that's very individual to the person. But for me, I can't do instant reactions, because I'm probably going to regret what my instant reaction was. I'm going to think about it and I'm going to change my mind. So I'm always going to be, maybe I see this message, but I'm going to give it about 10 hours before I respond. Or, yes, I just did this play test, but let it sit for 24, 48 hours, and then I'm gonna, like, redigest it. For me, digesting play tests is, I keep a designer diary on Board Game Geek. So often I will, write my pages of notes during the game, let it sit, and then go back a day or two later and write up my notes on my Board Game Geek diary to kind of digest what I felt was the summary of what happened, what kind of changes I decided to make moving forward, and then kind of how I felt with the direction of the game. So regardless of the feedback I got from, say, the publisher, I could look back and say, okay, this was originally what my intention is, but now with the publisher's input, it might change to this. And for me, it helps to see the steady changes to my game and where the different influences come, so they don't all mesh into one thing and become two different things.
Yeah, it's really important to sort of process everything before you can move on with changes and sort of like deal with feedback, I guess, or like response and feedback.
Yeah.
So I don't have any other questions, but did you want to like talk more before we open up to questions?
Actually, I think I covered most of the things. I would look for questions.
Did you create your prototype first and then take it to a publisher? And then once, if that is the way you did it, did they drastically change your original idea? And the second question is, did you shop publishers? And if so, what made you choose the publisher that you chose?
Okay, so I got two different approaches for my games. The first one, Bookability, I did not shop publishers until probably a year and a half into its development. And I'm sorry, can you state your first
You
question?
created a prototype. I'm asking before
Yes.
you went to the publisher.
Yes.
How much did it change?
Okay, so for Bookability and for Wicked and Wise, I created the prototype first. You always need a prototype for them to kind of play through your idea. Whenever I brought Bookability, it was as far along as I could personally push it, because again, I had a year and a half to change it to its final form. I also had no contacts in the gaming industry, not really, because I stuck to my local cons in Georgia, and I didn't really know any publishers, so I had to go to a publishing speed dating event, which they do at certain cons. The Indie Game Alliance does it. So I participated in that, and whenever you are able to make a connection there, the publishers will say, okay, well, we don't have enough time to play a game here, but maybe later in the con we can meet up and play a game. And I was able to get 3 publishers to do that from that sort of event. So that was very effective for me. And from that, I was able to get signed. But with Wicked and Wise, that one was a little bit special. I came up with the idea for Wicked and Wise probably the very end of September. Made a prototype October, and in November I took it to a convention, and one of the publishers who had played my first game decided to sit in, play that game in its very rough, very, very rough stages. She was really impressed with it, introduced me to another publisher, and they kind of kept bringing me around to different publisher friends. So it got signed from that November thing, and it had only been 2 months in the making. But that is the result of networking from the 1 to 2 years from the first game. So I think if you can get casual games in, that's really helpful. And that was really for my second one. As far as getting it changed, Bookability, it didn't get changed very much from how I had created the prototype. For Wicked and Wise, the core of the gameplay is still there, but it was so new that it is still changing. I don't say that it's so far from its original version, but it is evolving for sure. And I think that's also partly because it was so new as a game.
Bookability, what type of game mechanics would you say it actually is? Because I mean, I get an idea what the idea behind it is, but I can't picture what you're actually doing in the game.
So for Book of Villainy, it is a set collection strategy game. That the ninth one with the 8 cards are tiles, and they're like location tiles. And whenever you land on them, you're moving kind of in a rondo. So you can move up to 3 spaces at a time. You move on it, you activate its ability, which is usually to draw some type of card on there, and you are trying to collect these pages for your book. The pages are what are worth victory points, and the pages are divided into different types. So based off of what the little action tiles are, you are collecting cards that will help you create combos and get these victory point pages. Any other questions?
I was curious if in your game design, do you ever feel like you encounter multiple emotional cores? You know, you have an idea and there's several directions you can go with it. Have you ever had to like winnow that out, or do you always feel really pulled in a strong singular direction?
So with my first game, Book of Villainy, I definitely had that problem where there were 2 different emotional cores that kind of popped up. And that's because whenever I was trying out all these new mechanics, at some point I had 2 very fun games all smashed into one. But it was very obvious to the player that they were 2 separate games. And I had to decide which of those games I was actually chasing. And decided to table and maybe come back to the other one later. But I went back to my original core, and that was what made me decide, okay, this one's super fun, I love it, but that wasn't the original intent. And so I went in the other direction. Any other questions?
Can you give several examples of emotional cores, like maybe 3 or 4?
Sure. So, let's see. For my trick-taking game, Wicked and Wise, my emotional core is that feeling of, with very limited information, being able to help out my partner and collectively win. Be able to do something great. Just kind of like, yes, we did this. It's just a one single play. Because I want that to be the moment. That's the moment I'm chasing whenever I play this game. I can't give multiple because I only have the 2 games, but I can give the emotional cores for games I have played. Let's see, Splendor. So I love bringing out Splendor because it is a game that continually gives me satisfaction. And that satisfaction is what I'm chasing, both visually, as soon as it's out, just everything lines up, but also the chips that you get to handle are very satisfying and tactile in your hands. So whenever I'm showing it to people, it leaves such a nice impression, and it's just a very nice, quick, moving game that is that feeling I'm chasing of something to show, okay, this is a game that is not normally in your wheelhouse. This is probably going to go pretty well. And one other one would probably be, let's go with The Mind. The Mind is a card game, very simple, with 1 through 100. Cards are numbered 1 through 100. And the object of the game is to put these cards down sequentially without communicating to the other people playing. And everybody has to be silent unless they're saying stop or pause because something has gone out of sequence. It's a very, very simple game, but it creates so much intensity and so much drama. And I pulled it out with family who don't play games, friends who don't play games, taught it to them in 5 minutes. And they had so much fun that the friend who has ADD, doesn't like games, sat there and watched us play. She didn't even play. She was just sat there deeply involved as the audience, like, what are you doing? And like that kind of intensity, that kind of drama is something that I absolutely love. And you know, I don't know how they managed to achieve that with something so simple, but it's something very beautiful about that. And that to me is the emotional core for that game.
The mine's really interesting because when you describe it, or when anyone describes it to another person that's never played this game before, it sounds just like, oh, you're just putting numbers in a sequence. This isn't a game. This is just you counting.
Right.
But like when you actually do it, it's so much fun. It's like, oh, it's really exciting when you're all in sync.
Yeah.
We have this exercise, like when I play it with my friends, we, really weird, we put our hands on each other's temples and we're just like, okay, we're in sync now, we're gonna make it to like level 3 or level 4 or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's like really cool and interesting to see, you know, the way that people play with such a simple mechanic.
Yeah, exactly. And that really, to me, highlights that a game can tackle so many different things. It doesn't have to be super complex and super strategic, but it's really like, what is the mission of this game? Is it to create this social interaction? Is it, you know, to create this atmosphere? Or is it to like engage different parts of your mind and like kind of get into the more puzzly, mathematical, like number crunching sort of things? Like there's so many different aspects to game that people love, aspects to games that people love, that, you know, you have your variety of choices.
I'll ask one. This is so cool. I kind of want to talk about this a little bit more. So, like, I guess I have 2 questions here. One is that when I'm like making prototypes, I probably go way over the top because if I like make it just too cheap, it doesn't feel real enough. So like I like, you know, get wood out, like laminate stuff and things. Just wondering, like, what level of like production are you making for prototypes of this? And also, how do you know it's not working? I mean, are you getting teams to play test each one, or some of these you're like, whoa, I don't even know what to play this. I know this one doesn't work. I mean, like, kind of, can you talk us through a little bit of that
Sure.
process?
I'm gonna come over there if you don't mind.
Please.
So, for this first one, I remember I made because I worked a desk job at the time, and I just stared at my computer all day. And I literally, I don't know why we had construction paper, but we had construction paper. And I took it and I just cut out the paper at my desk and made this board by hand. Just because of the idea, like this is the very first one, and I was like, I think this is something I can make, is this possible? And I put it together with some construction paper. I self-tested this one and broke it and put it away. That's when I came to this, and then I started iterating on the computer. I'm pretty okay with Photoshop. So the majority of these I did in Photoshop. This one was whenever it started to look more like a Monopoly board, but it had like 3 levels, so you would go down into the middle, and like the prison was in here. Again, I just printed that at like the Office Depot. That also was another one I was just like, you know, maybe because people associated it way too much to Monopoly, I'll do the same thing, but I'll make it a weird shape. So I did that, but the thing about weird shapes, people don't know how to move them. So I played that with some friends. It was fun. They didn't know how to move, so I took it back to the drawing board, and I was like, okay, maybe instead of this flower thing, I'm going to do this. I was still kind of trying to stick to that design, but that's still not very indicative of how you should move. It's just a bunch of circles. So after playing that 1 or 2 times, scrapped it. Book of Villainy plays 2 to 5 players now, but originally 4 players. So I had a kind of a core group of 2 other friends that we would get together and just play. And I'm so grateful to them because they constantly played every single version of my game. But out of all the iterations, they never played the same game twice. This one was right whenever creative block was starting to happen. I was getting really confused. As you can see, it just kind of degraded to circles. I didn't actually play this one. This one just sat on my computer and I looked at it and I was like, what am I doing? This one is whenever I started getting together and made a really beautiful graphic prototype. I was like, this is the area for the cards. It was a huge board. Like from here to here. It was unnecessarily huge, you know, but pretty, beautiful colors. I made it like colorblind friendly, all the works. But you know, that got me through a couple of months, and I think really it was the graphics that got me through a couple of months. People were just, yeah, I'm into it, I'm loving it. That version I actually reprinted a couple of times. Maybe I kept it for 4 to 6 months, and the last version I even got it printed on like vinyl, so it was like you could roll it up, and it was easier to travel at conventions. But I shelled out all that money and I played it once, and then I had to scrap it. Got super frustrated, threw everything away, and then I decided, you know what, I'm just going to take a piece of poster board, and I hand drew board number 7. It was a really nice drawing of like a kind of a city dumpster backdrop, and you had these villains living on that city, because I like puns. And, you know, I went back to surface because I hadn't figured out how people moved, and it had a really good weekend at the convention, but the feedback that I got, you know, the timing of everything, it didn't mesh well. So back to the drawing board, scrapped it. I don't know what it was, culmination of podcasts, or maybe it was a game that triggered it, but I had the idea to try tiles. So I created 16 tiles, and players could choose which direction they wanted to go, and the tiles were activated. And it flowed so much better. I probably kept this one for about 8 months. Like all these were like maybe a couple weeks to a month each. But that one, 6 months, 3 days, and then we got like 8 months in. This tile formula was what I found that finally clicked with what I was going for with my game. And again, I use Component Studio, which is partnered with the Game Crafter. They are actually pretty affordable, because I think it was like 5 or 10 a month. And you just could go in there, create your components, and instead of like in Photoshop, I was changing everything, like every card one by one, I could just go in there, change one card, and it would change all of them. So that was like my favorite thing. I use Component Studio, and I created these tiles, and it was great. Print them out at, you can use them to print like a print and play PDF. And so I print that out at my local Office Depot, cut it out by hand, and did that. I managed, like right whenever I was ready to start pitching, and I got it in the sleekest form, was whenever I changed it from 16 cards to 8, because 16 was too many choices. So went with 8, it was a lot sleeker, moved a lot faster, and at that point I was really comfortable with just printing out my files. I even got a corner cutter, which I didn't know was a thing. But you can get corner cutters for like $10 and like smooth around those edges, and they just look like they came straight out of the factory, and they're super satisfying. If you print it out of cardstock, I'm still super excited about that. And that was where I landed with my last prototype. I never really needed to go and print a fancy version. I maybe did that twice, but just the nature of playtesting, you really try to hold on to things that you spend a lot of money on, and it's just like super disappointing whenever you have to scrap it. So I find it better to just print on cardstock and cut this stuff. So that's the evolution of what we're looking at.
the hour, so we got a couple of minutes between. If you want to go across to the makerspace and make your own poster,